12 teacups were placed perfectly, but the 13th appeared where no one remembered putting it. At a quiet village tea party, death was stirred in with sugar, and only Miss Marple noticed that one cup held more than just Earl Grey. It held murder. Lavender biscuits in curious numbers. It was a fine spring afternoon in St. Marry Me, the sort of day that invites gentle chatter, the clink of china, and the slow unfolding of secrets. Under the guise of civility, a pale sun filtered through the lace curtains of Mrs. Eliza Witherton's sitting-room, bathing the room in a delicate shimmer that danced upon her polished walnut table. 12 women had gathered at the invitation of Mrs. Witherton, a retired headmistress known for her unflinching punctuality, brisk manner, and fondness for rose-hip tea. She had insisted on a formal seating arrangement and naturally provided place cards bearing each guest's name in her spidery handwriting. At precisely 3, the first teacups were lifted, and a respectable quiet settled, broken only by the crisp snap of biscuits and the occasional titter over some minor scandal involving Mrs. Parsons' runaway poodle. The conversation glided, as it often did in such company, between flower competitions, church notices, and the latest installment of Colonel Easterbrook's memoirs in the Hampshire Gazette. Miss Marple, seated modestly near the window, stirred her tea with quiet deliberation. She was dressed in a dusky mauve cardigan with pearl buttons, and had pinned a sprig of lavender to her collar, a small act of seasonal rebellion, as she called it. Her pale blue eyes, however, were anything but rebellious. They were clear, curious, and gently observant. It was during the second round of pouring, when the lemon sponge had just been served, that Miss Marple noticed at the tea tray. It had been placed carefully on the sideboard earlier. Its floral pattern cups, arranged in 2 neat rows. Each teacup was unique, but harmonious, hand painted with wild flowers: primrose, bluebell, snowdrop, violet, and there were 13 of them. Miss Marple didn't react at first. She simply looked. Once again, 12 guests, 12 seated women, yet 13 cups, one of which sat untouched at the very edge of the tray, as if placed there absent-mindedly. The 13th cup bore a delicate spray of forget-me-nots, and, unlike the others, had a faint crack along the rim. She tilted her head slightly. There had been no mention of a 13th guest, no last-minute cancellations. Mrs. Witherton, for all her pride in planning, had made no indication of an error, and such an oversight in her home would be nearly unthinkable. "How clever of Gwen to remember that little tune," said Lady Verwood, suddenly drawing Miss Marple's attention back to the room. "I hadn't heard it in decades. French, wasn't it?" The woman in question, Miss Gwen Halbert, had just risen from the upright piano in the corner, where she'd played a haunting melody, slow, soft, and oddly familiar. Gwen was a refined creature, with steel-gray hair, a sharp jawline, and a striking streak of old glamour that clung to her like an echo. She nodded modestly. "It's called Doors Mat," Gwen said. "I learned in Marseilles many years ago a children's lullaby." Lady Verwood touched her forehead. "How peculiar! It made me feel rather faint." She smiled quickly to dismiss it, but Miss Marple noted the tremor in her teacup as she set it down. As the room returned to polite small talk, Miss Marple sipped thoughtfully. It was nothing, of course, nothing at all, a spare cup, a forgotten place, setting, but it nagged at her in the quiet way of half-remembered dreams. After tea, they drifted into the garden, admiring the emerging tulips and the early blush of apple blossoms. The air was filled with bees and compliments. Miss Marple remained indoors for a moment, drawn toward the tea tray. Once more she counted again. 13 cups. All had been used, save one. The forget-me-not cup remained slightly apart from the others, as though it had never quite belonged. She heard footsteps behind her. "You noticed it too?" said Gwen softly. Miss Marple turned. "I beg your pardon." "The 13th cup," Gwen said, her voice low. "You were counting them." Miss Marple smiled, faintly surprised. "An old habit. I always notice odd numbers. They tend to unsettle the table." Gwen looked at the tray. "It's not part of a set. I brought it with me." "Oh, yes, a sentimental thing. My mother's. She used to say it held her memories better than her diary ever could." She gave a small laugh, almost bitter. "It's rather silly." "Not at all," said Miss Marple, her eyes steady. "But I wonder why you placed it on the tray. It appears out of place." Gwen didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window at the women in the garden, their laughter drifting like pollen in the breeze. "I suppose," she said at last, "some memories refused to be left out then." Without another word, she turned and joined the others among the tulips. Miss Marple remained still. Her fingers brushed the rim of the 13th cup. It was cold, slightly rough. There was a pale ring of residue at the bottom, not from tea, but from something heavier, darker. She narrowed her eyes. A gust of wind rattled the window pane. Somewhere in the garden someone called out a burst of laughter, perhaps, but the sound was muffled, distant. The sitting room felt suddenly colder. 13 teacups, one not poured, and a melody meant to soothe children had made a woman faint. Miss Marple turned slowly and looked once more at the forget-me-not cup. Something had begun. A song remembered the following morning broke. With a pale, uncertain sky, a light mist clung to the hedgerows and drifted lazily through the lanes of St. Mary-me, like a dream reluctant to end. Miss Marple, rising early, as always, sipped her morning tea by the parlor window, her knitting untouched on her lap. The 13th teacup still troubled her, and more than that, Gwen Halbert's face, when she had mentioned her mother's memory, that sharp flickering something behind her eyes, pain perhaps, or fear. Shortly after 9, Miss Marple wrapped herself in her rose-wool coat and set out for a walk. She moved gently, nodding to Mr. Wakefield trimming his hedge, and to young Sally from the post office, riding her bicycle past the butcher's van. By the time she reached the Witherton residence, a black motor car was parked outside the front door. Was ajar. A strange sensation gripped her, not dread precisely, but a quiet recognition that something had shifted. She stepped carefully onto the gravel path. Inside, Mrs. Witherton was pale and tight-lipped, her usually stiff posture wilting, as if someone had pulled loose a single thread from the corset of her life. "She's dead, Miss Marple," she said softly. "Gwen Halbert, they found her in her garden this morning. The maid spotted her from the window just after 7. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. Was it sudden? Mrs. Witherton hesitated. "They're not sure. The doctor is still with her. No sign of violence, at least not that I know of." But she looked terribly afraid, as if she saw something. Just before it happened, there was silence in the hallway, thick and still. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Did she take anything? A tonic, a sleeping draught?" "She didn't mention anything to me." Eliza pressed her fingers together, trembling slightly. "But you saw how odd she was yesterday, didn't you? The way she played that music, it gave me the chills." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "Do you know the name of it?" "I haven't the foggiest." "But Miss Marple, did she walk down the path to the garden gate and turned right, not toward the village center, but to the far end of the lane, where the widow Lady Verwood lived, in a modest brick house veiled in ivy?" A curious choice for a titled woman, modesty, but Miss Marple had long suspected Lady Verwood was the sort who preferred quiet shadows over candle-lit attention. Lady Verwood opened the door herself. "Oh, Miss Marple." She looked startled, her pale face even paler in the morning light. "I didn't expect company. I just wanted to ask about the song Miss Halbert played yesterday," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "You seem to recognize it." Lady Verwood's lips parted, then pressed firmly shut again. "Yes," she said at last. "I heard it many years ago during the war in Paris. There was a woman who used to sing it, a governess or nurse, a strange creature. We lodged in the same building briefly. She sang it often to a child." Miss Marple tilted her head. "What happened to them?" "I don't know," said Lady Verwood too quickly. "I left before the occupation worsened." A lie. Miss Marple thought she didn't show it. Instead, she smiled gently. "It's a beautiful melody," she said, "and rather sad." Lady Verwood said nothing. Miss Marple took her leave soon after, and made her way down the lane to the churchyard. There she found the vicar's wife trimming daffodils near the lych gate, and after a brief conversation about the Sunday bake sale, learned that Gwen Halbert had arrived at St. Mary-me just 5 months earlier. "No family to speak of," said Mrs. Pomeroy, brushing her skirts, though there was talk of a sister lost during the Blitz. Gwen never spoke much about the war, kept to herself. That evening Miss Marple visited the Halbert residence, a small weather-beaten cottage, with ivy creeping up the chimney. The garden, where Gwen had been found, was modest, filled with forget-me-nots, lavender, and a patch of violets. It smelled of damp earth and spring rain. "D.R. Rawlings stood at the gate. She died of poisoning," he said grimly. "Though what kind we don't yet know. No bruises, no wounds, just a shattered teacup beside her, the same one I believe she brought yesterday." Miss Marple's mouth thinned. "Was anything found in the house?" An open letter half burned in the grate. It was addressed to a C. no last name. Inside the house, Gwen's sitting room was sparse but elegant. A photograph stood on the mantelpiece, a young woman in uniform, holding a baby. Gwen, perhaps, or her mother. A faded photograph. The baby's face had been scratched out. A strange chill passed through Miss Marple in the study. She found a small locked drawer. With the doctor's permission, it was opened with a thin letter opener. Inside were 2 things: a pressed red maple leaf and a torn page from a diary. "I saw her again today. She doesn't recognize me, But I know what she did. She handed me over as she saved herself. Miss Marple folded the paper. Quietly the pieces were beginning to move. 13 cups. A woman who remembered a lullaby. A second who reacted as if to a ghost. And a final teacup, cracked, broken, filled with something. Gwen had poured herself, or had she? Miss Marple stepped out into the garden. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves. She stooped near the flower bed where the cup had been found. The soil was disturbed, and just under the surface she saw it, a fragment of china, floral, cracked and stained faintly, not with tea, but with something darker, bitter. She straightened slowly, her eyes turned not toward the garden, but toward the past, where every cup held a memory, and some were poisoned long before they ever touched the lips. Whispers behind teacups. The days that followed Gwen Halbert's death fell strangely silent in St. Mary Me, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Curtains twitched more frequently. Conversations dropped to murmurs. Even the bird song outside the grocer's seemed oddly subdued. Miss Marple, however, moved through it all with characteristic calm. She had seen grief in many forms, and understood that often it was not the absence of a person that unsettled people, but the absence of answers. She returned to Mrs. Witherden's home the following afternoon, carrying a small jar of marmalade and a spring rig of mint from her garden. "Eliza," she said gently as the door opened, "I wonder if we might talk about yesterday and the tea." Mrs. Witherton led her into the parlor, noticeably more tired than before. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea. Only 2 cups this time, both plain white. Miss Marple watched closely. "There's something I didn't mention," Eliza said quietly once they were seated. "After the party ended, I noticed one of the place cards was missing." "Which one?" "Gwen's." She sighed. "I assumed she took it with her. People keep odd souvenirs, don't they?" Miss Marple said nothing at first. She simply stirred her tea, gently clinking the spoon against the porcelain. "Eliza," she said after a moment, "has Gwen ever spoken of the war?" "Only once. She told me she'd work with refugees and France children. Mostly, she had a habit of humming lullabies. When she thought no one was listening, she hesitated, then added, I never asked questions. It seemed painful." Miss Marple leaned forward. "And yet she brought a cup, one that didn't belong. Why do you think she did that?" Eliza blinked. "I honestly don't know. But Miss Marple did. Some objects were not meant for drinking. They were meant for signaling. Gwen had brought that teacup like a soldier wearing a uniform to be recognized by the right person." After leaving Mrs. Witherden's, Miss Marple paid a visit to Constable Reeves at the village station. He stood behind a modest desk, fiddling with a fountain pen. "Morning, Miss Marple. I suppose you've come about Miss Halbert." "I have. Well, nothing's confirmed yet, but the coroner suspects foxglove poisoning. Digitalis. That is, acts quickly if taken in a concentrated form." Miss Marple nodded slowly, "And the teacup found beside her in pieces. Now one of the lab boys cut himself on it. Apparently, there was residue, bitter brown, and quite definitely not tea. We've sent it to London for testing." She took a breath. "There was something else in her house, wasn't there?" Reeves hesitated, then pulled out a folder. "Yes, this was found behind a chest of drawers in the spare room." He passed her a faded envelope, yellowing at the edges. "Unsent letter. No return. Address read, if you like." Miss Marple opened it carefully. The handwriting was tight and urgent. "To whom it may concern, if I die suddenly, it was not an accident. Someone from that room knows what happened in 1944. I recognized her face, but not her name. She has changed her hair and her story, but not her eyes. There was no signature." Miss Marple folded the letter and returned it to the folder. Her expression did not change, but inwardly the pieces were clicking into place slowly, like chessmen shifting before checkmate. That evening she visited the library. It was nearly empty except for a sleeping boy behind the desk and the faint smell of musty pages. She requested the local wartime register, the one containing names of evacuees, volunteers, and lodging hosts in Hampshire between 1940 and 1946. She spent over an hour flipping through it. There, on the 4th page of the Brompton Hollow listings, it appeared Halbert Genevieve the C. billeted at Fern Hollow Cottage with Mrs. Vera Mallory. Arrived April 1944. Occupation translator. Status discharged January 1945. Below, a child, female, unnamed, age approximately 1. No record of discharge. Line struck through a faint mark had been made in red pencil, then scrubbed out, but it was there. Miss Marple left the library with the register number noted in her small black book. The next morning she returned to see Lady Verwood. I hope I'm not intruding," she said as the door opened. "Not at all," Lady Verwood replied, her tone controlled, but her eyes darted to the side as if seeking an escape route. "I wondered if I might ask you again about the woman you mentioned," Miss Marple said as she stepped into the drawing room. "The one who sang the French lullaby during the war. Lady Verwood's expression hardened. I don't know why this matters. Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. She walked toward the bookshelf and gently ran her finger along the spines, not reading the titles, but observing the layer of dust, the arrangement. You do remember her, she said at last. She stayed with you briefly. There was a child, and one night the child vanished. Lady Verwood froze. No one ever reported it. Miss Marple continued calmly. But the bulletin log recorded a discrepancy. A child was present, then not, and Gwen Halbert's unsent letter names you, albeit cryptically. She said you'd change your hair, but not your eyes. Lady Verwood's voice cracked. She wasn't supposed to come back. Not here. Miss Marple turned to her gently. She came not to accuse you, but to remind you, to force you to remember, and perhaps to see if you would apologize. She threatened me. Lady Verwood whispered no. Miss Marple said she gave you a chance to speak the truth. She brought the 13th teacup, so you would recognize it, the same pattern your governess used. She wanted you to react. She sang that lullaby on purpose. Lady Verwood's knees buckled, and she said I didn't kill her. I swear I didn't. Miss Marple's voice was soft, but firm. Someone did. As she left the house, the wind picked up again, rustling the hedges along the lane. Miss Marple walked home slowly, the sound of the lullaby threading through her thoughts like mist between the trees. The teacup had been her signal, the song, her challenge. Someone in that room had chosen silence over remorse, and now over justice, and Miss Marple, of course, would see it through. The widow's garden, the garden behind Gwen Halbert's cottage, had grown wild with purpose. Violets had crept into the vegetable beds, ferns crowded around the broken stone bench, and the climbing rose had overtaken the shed, entirely curling through its slats like searching fingers. But beneath the chaos, there was care. Each plant had been tended, once the tools worn, but oiled, the borders uneven, but not abandoned. Miss Marple stood quietly among the lavender, her shoes damp from the morning dew. The air held the scent of damp soil, and something subtler, lemon balm, perhaps, though something darker, lingered beneath it. She had come alone, with the reluctant permission of Constable Reeves, who had agreed that her instincts, while unconventional, were rarely wrong, especially in matters of gardens and murder. She opened the shed door. With some effort it groaned on its hinges. Inside, the gloom thickened. A single wooden shelf held a cracked flower pot, an old thermos, and a square biscuit tin, its lid askew. Miss Marple peered inside. Photographs, dozens, bundled with a silk ribbon, now faded to ash gray. The topmost image showed a woman, younger, but unmistakably Gwen, standing beside a French milestone. A bicycle leaned against the stone. Her smile was tight, determined. A baby, swaddled tightly, rested in her arms. Miss Marple flipped through the others. Slowly, several were of children, most nameless. Others showed buildings partially collapsed, or groups of men and women in military uniforms, with faces scratched out. One, however, caught her breath. A tea set laid out in a courtyard, the very same forget-me-not teacup visible in the foreground, surrounded by 12 others, neatly arranged. She returned the bundle gently, and turned toward the back of the shed. There, behind a cracked ceramic planter, the floorboards bore the faint trace of having been lifted recently. She knelt, ran her fingers along the edge, and found a loose board. Beneath it lay a rusted tin box. She pried it open with a nearby tell. Inside were fragments, scraps of paper, newspaper clippings, and one sealed envelope labeled Mallory, May 1944. In thick ink the name was familiar. Now Mrs. Vera Mallory, the woman with whom Gwen had been billeted. She opened the envelope carefully. To whoever finds this, if anything happens to me, know this: the child was not lost. She was taken. I believe it was deliberate. The woman who called herself Lady Mallory was not who she claimed to be. She fled before I could act. I believe she changed her identity. If she is in England, she may have married into a title, or used one she never earned. I have been looking ever since. Miss Marple's breath caught the paper, shook slightly in her hand. She folded the note with precision and tucked it into her handbag. Lady Verwood's denial had been far too tidy. Later that day, Miss Marple returned to the village hall. The local Women's Aid Committee was hosting a modest charity auction, and the entire hall buzzed with polite laughter and the scent of sponge cake. Lady Verwood stood near the bookstore, speaking too brightly with the vicar's wife. Her gloves were immaculate, her smile rehearsed. Miss Marple approached with careful ease. "My dear Lady Verwood," she said, "what an admirable collection of books! So, is that the poems of Apollinaire? How curious, French, no less." Lady Verwood glanced down. "A relic. I have no use for it. Now really." Miss Marple turned a page. "This one is marked music. There are children hidden in the walls. Sounds like something from the Resistance. "Doesn't it, Lady Verwood?" froze Miss Marple, continued pleasantly. "You know, I had the pleasure of speaking to an archivist yesterday. It seems you're not listed in any of the British Red Cross war records under your maiden name." The other woman said nothing. Miss Marple looked directly into her eyes. "You never served under your real name, because you weren't Vera O'Leary, and Gwen found you." Lady Verwood turned away. Miss Marple's voice dropped to a murmur. "She didn't come to kill you. She wanted acknowledgement, perhaps even forgiveness. But someone else, someone who knew what she was about to expose, made certain she stayed silent." Lady Verwood looked over her shoulder. Her face had gone pale. "I didn't poison her," she whispered. Miss Marple's expression softened, just slightly. "But you knew someone who could have." That evening, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Cray at the constabulary. He was a large man with a quiet voice and enormous hands, which he folded now over a notepad filled with scribbles. "You believe this wasn't about the war alone?" he asked. "I believe it began there," said Miss Marple calmly. "But it ended here, in a garden with a teacup, and with someone who had more to lose than just their reputation." She placed the photographs in the note on the desk. This was not Gwen's first attempt. She had tried to confront Lady Verwood twice before, once by letter, once in person. She was turned away both times, but when she recognized another face at the tea, someone unexpected, she acted. The 13th Teacup was her signal, and it frightened someone enough to kill Craig. Studied her face. "Who then?" Miss Marple gave a faint, weary smile. "I believe the answer lies in a signature that never appeared. Gwen never signed her letters, but she always included a pressed red leaf, a symbol. One was found in her diary, one in her shed, and one, I suspect, may have been tucked somewhere else, perhaps slipped into the wrong hands." Craig tapped his pen. "I'll authorize a full search of Lady Verwood's home." Miss Marple shook her head. "Not hers," she said softly. "Search Eliza Witherton's." As the clock struck 9, rain began to fall softly on the windows of Brompton Hollow, and in a quiet corner of a wild garden the violets swayed again, their roots deep in the soil. Gwen had once tended a woman who had spent years seeking justice, not revenge, who had remembered a child long after others had forgotten, and who had died not from the weight of the past, but from the fear it stirred in someone else. The man with the scar. Rain fell steadily over street. "Marry me." The next morning, soft and persistent, like a whisper repeating itself, most villages remained indoors, the streets quiet except for the occasional swish of a bicycle or the low bark of a dog chasing shadows. Miss Marple sat by the fire, crocheting in her usual chair. Though her hands moved with less certainty than usual, her mind was occupied not with yarn or pattern but with teacup scars and the silence that followed Gwen Halbert's death. She had asked Inspector Cray, for one thing, to make discreet inquiries about Eliza Witherton's past, not because she suspected malice outright, but because something in Eliza's behavior had struck her as too measured, too well prepared. Just before noon, Constable Reeves arrived at her door, rain dripping from his hat. "You were right, Miss Marple," he said. "We've uncovered something. Eliza Witherton's brother. He went missing in 1944, officially a prisoner of war. But Gwen Halberd mentioned a betrayal in one of her coded letters. The name she used, Edward W." Miss Marple set her teacup down gently. "And Eliza never mentioned him. Not once, not in the public records, not to neighbors. It's as if he was wiped clean." Miss Marple nodded, and the man with the limp. Reeves blinked. "How did you?" "Because Gwen mentioned someone changing their name, their story, but not their eyes that afternoon." Miss Marple walked through the village, her umbrella a modest shield against the drizzle. She passed the greengrocer's, the milliner's, and then turned sharply into the lane behind the inn. A path few used, unless they had reason, it was there. She found him, a tall, narrow man in a mackintosh coat, leaning heavily on a stick, his left leg dragging slightly. His hat was pulled low, but Miss Marple needed only a glance to see the deep curved scar cutting down from his ear to the edge of his jaw. "Mr. Lennox," she said gently, approaching. He turned, startled. "I'm sorry," she added. "I've wanted to thank you for the chrysanthemums you left at the church last week." Such a thoughtful gesture. He relaxed slightly. "I'll thank you. I used to grow them long ago." They began to walk. Miss Marple let the silence linger before speaking again. "I knew someone years ago who had a scar, just like yours. He worked as a courier during the war. Brave fellow, nearly died delivering a message behind enemy lines." Mr. Lennox's steps faltered. Miss Marple continued, as if reminiscing. "He was betrayed, though, by someone he trusted. The Germans knew exactly where he would be. Only one person could have passed that information along." Lennox stopped walking. "What is it you want, madam?" She looked up at him to know what happened to Gwen Halbert. His eyes narrowed. I had nothing to do with that. I didn't say you did. But you were at the tea. You saw her. And I believe you recognized her. Just as she recognized you. He glanced away. She remembered. I could see it in her face all these years. She still blamed me. Did you betray her? Lennox didn't answer. He turned sharply and limped away, disappearing into the mist. Miss Marple stood in the lane, unmoving. She didn't believe he had killed Gwen, not directly. But guilt could bend a man's spine more than war wounds ever could. That evening Miss Marple invited Inspector Cray and Constable Reeves to tea. She served lemon scone and cucumber sandwiches, with the crusts neatly trimmed. I believe the motive lies not in the war, she said after pouring the second round, but in what survived it. Cray looked up. Go on. Eliza Witherton had a brother, Edward, who was captured after a betrayal. Gwen spent years trying to trace the responsible party. When she found Eliza, she must have suspected the truth, that Eliza's brother wasn't captured by chance. He was given up by someone close. Reeves frowned. But how does that lead to Gwen's death? Because Gwen didn't stop there. She discovered something else. She linked Eliza to another identity, Vera Mallory, the woman who fled France with forged papers and left a child behind. A child Gwen may have tried to save. Cray leaned forward. You believe Eliza and Vera Mallory are the same? Miss Marple nodded. And Gwen had proof, photographs, letters, perhaps even the teacup itself, a token of identification. So Eliza did what people do when they're desperate. She tried to silence her. But how? Reeves asked. We saw Eliza the entire time at the tea. Gwen poured her own drink. Miss Marple opened a small notebook and showed them a drawing, a teacup, with a thin line on the rim and a faint mark beneath. Hairline cracks, she said, easy to lace with powdered. Digitalis. Days before the gathering, the poison stays hidden until liquid is added. Gwen drank from her own cup, the one she brought, not knowing it had been sabotaged in advance. Cray exhaled slowly. So the poison was waiting for her. Miss Marple nodded. Eliza knew Gwen would use that specific cup. She made sure it was tainted. There was silence in the room. Then Cray stood. We'll bring her in tonight. But they were too late. Eliza Witherton was found unconscious in her parlor, a vial of sleeping draught on the table and a single sheet of writing paper beneath her hand. Miss Marple read the letter quietly. I was only trying to protect what little dignity remained. I could not let her destroy everything. My brother died because he loved her, and she used him. I wanted peace. I only ever wanted peace. There was no signature, just a faint smudge where a teardrop had fallen. Miss Marple placed the letter on the inspector's desk and turned away her hands, trembling faintly. Gwen had not come to expose a villain. She had come to restore a truth, a buried, painful truth that had lived too long in shadow, and in doing so she had unearthed guilt that had long since curdled into something fatal. Secrets in China. Blue. The Witherton house stood still under the gray veil of late afternoon. A constable remained at the door, and Inspector Cray paced the parlor inside, reading Eliza's letter for the third time. She had survived her suicide attempt, but remained unconscious at the infirmary, her fate uncertain, and her guilt unspoken. Miss Marple, meanwhile, stood in Eliza's kitchen looking at the china cupboard. Everything was in its proper place. Bone-white saucers stacked by size, milk jugs turned inward like shy children, and teacups aligned in rigid symmetry. All that is except one, the forget-me-not cup. It was missing. May I? She asked the officer on duty. He nodded. She opened the cupboard door fully and leaned down, inspecting the back corner. Nothing. She examined the shelves with care, then lifted the carpet in front of the sink. Still nothing. Then, with a slow exhale, she turned to the corner, been lined in thick brown paper, half full with kitchen scraps. There it was, shattered, tucked beneath a crust of burnt toast, and an orange peel. The delicate blue of the forget-me-not pattern glinted faintly among the broken ceramic. The handle was missing, the rim jagged, a cruel, deliberate act destroyed after the murder. Miss Marple murmured, but why? She retrieved a cloth from the drawer, lifted the largest fragment, and turned it over. There, in faint gold script on the underside, was a single word, sever, rare, valuable. Not something one simply drank from. It was the kind of porcelain that signified heritage, connection, legacy. When had brought it for a reason. Later that evening, Miss Marple visited the local antique dealer, Mr. Alcott, a man of thin spectacles, yellow gloves, and an encyclopedic knowledge of cups, coins, and scandal. Ah, he said, peering at the shard she laid on his velvet pad. Late 1800s Sèvres porcelain. This isn't just decorative, Miss Marple. It's part of a diplomatic tea set made for the French consulate. Very rare, very specific. Could someone trace it? She asked. Oh yes, most certainly. Every piece was documented. In fact, if I recall, one set went missing during the war, vanished entirely. from a private estate in Provence. Rumors said it was looted, perhaps smuggled into England. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Do you know who owned it last? Alcott lifted a ledger from beneath the counter, licked his finger, and flipped swiftly. Yes, the Aubriac family, the last known eyes, was a young girl, Genevieve Claire Aubriac. Gwen Halbert, Miss Marple whispered. She was the child. She walked home slowly, thoughts layered like sediment in her mind. The puzzle had deepened. Gwen was not merely a witness. She was an heir, the child whom Lady Verwood had once known, a child given away, hidden, or abandoned during the war, a child who had returned with proof of her identity and of the crimes committed to erase at the sea teacup. Was her evidence a relic of lineage, a whisper from the past? The next morning, Inspector Cray returned to Eliza's house. With a search warrant, the attic yielded more than he expected. Inside a cedar trunk were sealed envelopes, many unopened, addressed to Genevieve C. Auriac. Each was marked "Return to sender." Dozens of letters, each more desperate than the last. Gwen had written them all, and Eliza had kept them hidden, unread. But there was one more discovery. In the back of the trunk, beneath the woolen shawl, lay a folded tapestry embroidered with forget-me-nots, the same floral motif as the cup, the same hand likely that had painted it, a family heirloom preserved in secret. She wanted to silence. When Craig said bitterly, not just out of guilt, but to protect her lies, to keep the village from knowing who Gwen really was. Miss Marple corrected him softly. No, Inspector, Gwen was killed not to protect lies, but to prevent the truth from rewriting everything, a truth that would have cost reputations, perhaps even inheritances. He looked at her. You mean she was the rightful heir to the Auriac estate, and possibly the consular properties left behind in France? Someone knew that someone at the tea table had more to lose than Eliza. Cray frowned. But who? Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. The woman who fainted when she heard the lullaby, the one who assumed Gwen wouldn't remember her, but Gwen did, and she sang that melody on purpose. Craig stood slowly. Lady Verwood. That evening a quiet interview was arranged at the Verwood estate. The drawing room was all lavender upholstery and antique glass, dimly lit by a brass lamp. Lady Verwood sat very still, her hands in her lap, face composed. We know Gwen was Genevieve Aubriac. Craig began. She had proof, the teacup, the tapestry, the letters, and she knew someone at the tea had helped erase her from the record. Lady Verwood remained silent. She sang a lullaby. Miss Marple added, not to unsettle you, but to see if you recognized her. You did. I remembered the child, Lady Verwood said softly, but I never knew what happened to her after the evacuation. I swear it, you knew. Miss Marple said you gave her up, left her behind. She was an inconvenience. You weren't married. You wanted to protect your future. Lady Verwood's jaw tightened. It was wartime. I was 17, terrified. I had nothing, and she was a mistake. Miss Marple's voice dropped. And when Gwen came back with proof of who she was, not just your daughter, but the heir to an estate, you quietly claimed. During the confusion you panicked. No, she whispered. You saw the cup, Miss Marple continued. Recognized the pattern. You'd seen it before, hadn't you? And when Gwen brought it to the tea table, it was not an act of sentiment. It was a declaration. Cray leaned forward. Did you poison it? No, Lady Verwood snapped. I never touched it. Miss Marple tilted her head. Then who did? There was silence, long and tremulous. Then Lady Verwood whispered, I think Eliza told me about Gwen's identity before the tea. She wanted to protect me. She said we could lose everything. I didn't ask how. Miss Marple nodded. You didn't kill her, but you let it happen. As the night deepened, Miss Marple returned home beneath a sky thick with unshed rain. She lit a lamp and set the final teacup fragment by the windowsill, a forget-me-not blooming in china blue. When it tried to speak, not with anger, but with remembrance, she had come to reclaim a place that was hers by blood and had been shattered for it. But soon the truth would be whole again. The ghost child. The weather turned cold. The next day looked bitter, but sharp, with a wind that tugged at scarf ends and rattled window panes. It brought with it a feeling of exposure, as if things hidden too long were finally coming to light. At the edge of St. Mary, the vicar's wife, was the first to see her, a pale figure barefoot and drifting at the edge of the woods, just beyond the old boundary wall of the Witherton property. The woman, or perhaps girl, wore a thin white dressing gown and clutched something to her chest. She didn't speak. She simply moved with a slow, eerie calm through the undergrowth, then disappeared behind the thorn hedge. Within the hour, whispers of a ghost child spread across the village. By afternoon, 5 people had claimed to see her. Some swore she had long dark hair. Others said she hummed an old lullaby. Miss Marple said nothing. She merely put down her newspaper and requested a cup of strong tea. That evening, Miss Marple walked to the Witherton house with Inspector Cray. Eliza remained in hospital unconscious, but stable the constable stationed at the door nodded them. Through the parlor smelled faintly of lavender and mothballs. Nothing had changed. Miss Marple climbed the stairs. Without invitation, at the end of the corridor was a door that hadn't been opened during previous searches. It led to what once might have been a nursery. Faded yellow wallpaper, a small iron-framed bed, and a moth-eaten rocking horse. The windows were shut, but the wardrobe in the corner had its door slightly ajar. Inside, she found a bundle of linen, a child's dress, preserved with astonishing care, white cotton delicately embroidered, with a blue ribbon around the waist, the exact shade of the forget-me-not teacup pinned to the collar, was a label Genevieve Claire, Paris, 1943. Miss Marple inhaled slowly. Not evidence, not a weapon, just memory folded into fabric. But someone had kept it. Someone had not forgotten. Downstairs, Cray waited with an open notebook. "Have you changed your mind?" he asked her. "About who really did it?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Uber, but I think it's time the village heard what Gwen never got to say." Craig raised an eyebrow. "You mean a public confrontation?" Miss Marple nodded. "Once 2 days later, a quiet gathering was arranged at the church hall. No announcements, no invitations. Yet by 4 every chair was filled." The vicar stood uncomfortably at the back, pretending to check him. Miss Marple rose from her seat and faced the room. Lady Verwood sat near the front, stiff-backed, avoiding eye contact. Mr. Lennox was absent. So was Eliza, still too weak to speak for herself. "I will be brief," Miss Marple began, her voice calm but clear. "Most of you knew Gwen Halberd as a quiet, refined woman. Some of you may now realize that she was in fact Genevieve Claire Aubriac, the only daughter of a French diplomat left behind during the war, and presumed dead." Murmurs rippled. "She survived. She was raised in hiding, and in time, she traced her identity back to this village, to this very room." She recognized faces, names, and voices. She brought with her evidence a sea teacup, a tapestry, letters, and she came not for vengeance, but for acknowledgement. Silence. Miss Marple turned toward Lady Verwood. "You recognized her, didn't you?" The other woman hesitated, then very quietly, "Yes." "And you said nothing?" "I was ashamed." Miss Marple nodded. "But you were not alone. Someone else feared what Gwen's return might cost them. So they prepared the cup, the very one she always drank from, with a subtle poison, not enough to strike immediately, but enough to kill." Miss Marple turned to face the room. "That person was Eliza Witherton." Gasps erupted. One woman dropped her knitting. Another began to cry softly. She had long buried a betrayal, her brother's, and perhaps her own. Gwen had uncovered it. The letters, the photographs, all pointed back to a lie that could no longer be managed. "But how can we know?" someone asked from the back. "How can we be sure it wasn't suicide?" Miss Marple took a breath. "Because Gwen wrote a final letter. It was found tucked inside her Bible, which Eliza had attempted to burn. Only part of it survived, but it is unmistakable. If anything happens to me, I want the truth remembered. I was not born when I was born, Genevieve, and I have come home." After the gathering, Miss Marple walked slowly through the lane. Behind the church, the trees swayed softly. Above her, evening light glimmered on the stone walls near the edge of the woods. She paused. A faint humming came through the trees. She stepped forward. There, in a quiet clearing, stood a young woman in a worn white dress. Her hair was long and tangled, her feet bare, her eyes far away. Miss Marple did not flinch. "Genevieve," she said gently. The girl blinked, then smiled faintly. "No," she said, "I'm just a memory of her." Then she turned and walked into the trees, vanishing with the wind. That night, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her teacup in hand. It was not the savor kind, merely old bone china with a single pink rose bud, but it held what she needed: warmth, memory, and silence. She reflected not on crime, but on truth. How some truths don't demand justice, only remembrance. Genevieve Claire Aubriac had come home not as a ghost, but as a woman who dared to ask a simple question: "Do you remember me?" And Miss Marple had answered. It rained again the next morning, soft and steady, tracing lines down the windows of Street Mary Me, like ink bleeding across parchment. In the parlor of her modest home, Miss Marple laid a single forget-me-not flower on her side table, beside her cup of darling. She did not drink it just yet. There was something to be done. First, a knock at the door. Inspector Cray entered, raincoat damp, and hat in hand. His face bore the look of a man who had walked too long between moral stones, each heavier than the last. "She's gone," he said quietly. "Ella Witherton passed in the early hours, never woke again." Miss Marple nodded, expression unreadable, "And her things locked and sealed. But we found this." He placed a leather notebook on the table, faded, thin, tied With string, Miss Marple opened it gently. Inside were pages of tightly written lines, half memory, half confession. It was not just guilt Eliza had recorded, it was a slow, spiraling record of fear. Gwen's first letter, her arrival, her face, so similar to her mother's, and a terrible sentence. She knows what I did, what I didn't stop. I thought it had been erased, the war with Eliza. Little girl, but she came to tea. She sang the song. She brought the cup. She is the cup. Miss Marple read in silence. She knew what would come, she murmured, and she chose to let it happen, not for power, not for revenge, but to preserve the illusion of a quiet life. Cray sat down, exhaling slowly. Gwen wanted her past to be acknowledged, and for that, she died. Miss Marple looked out at the rain. Not entirely. Some things live beyond the flesh. Names, motives, courage. Craig studied her. You've solved many murders in your time. Do they always end like this? She smiled. Faintly, no, Inspector. Some end in trial, some in scandal. But the quietest ones, the ones buried deepest, they end in someone's parlor, where a woman sits and remembers. The inquest was held 3 days later. The verdict was sealed as death by misadventure, though those present understood the deeper undercurrent. No charges were filed. Eliza was dead. Lady Verwood left the village, quietly, her estate placed under management, and Genevieve Claire Aurillac. When Hal Bird was buried in the village cemetery, under a name she chose not the one, she was given her grave read Genevieve Claire, Hal Bird, 1928 to 1953, she remembered. Miss Marple stood at the funeral with a pale gray coat and gloved hands clasped before her. No eulogy was read, but someone, perhaps the vicar's wife, left a tiny sever shard among the violets on the grave, and someone else no one saw who left 13 forget-me-nots, fresh and dewy, arranged in a circle. That evening Miss Marple finally poured her tea. She added no sugar, no milk, just a clean cup, and a steady hand. Across from her sat Raymond West, her nephew, visiting from London, a novelist, and a man too fond of metaphors. He leaned forward and said, "A murder at a tea party, Aunt Jane, it's almost poetic." Miss Marple smiled. "Murder often is, but it's rarely poetry to the dead." Raymond hesitated. "And do you believe she came here for justice?" Miss Marple sipped, then set the cup down. "I believe she came for 2 reasons: to be seen and to be believed, and perhaps in her quiet way to ask for a place in the world that was once taken from her. And she got it. She got memory," Miss Marple said, "which is the root of justice. Everything else is temporary." Raymond looked thoughtfully toward the fire. "And the others, do they sleep soundly?" "Now, no one ever does," she said, "not after a teacup has been poured." With malice they sat together in silence. The fire crackled. The rain stopped somewhere outside. A blackbird sang. Later Miss Marple returned to her desk. She opened her drawer and placed the savory shard into a small wooden box beside a dried rose petal and a train ticket from a long-past case. Each item held a story. Each belonged to someone who had in one way or another knocked quietly on her door. Before closing the box, she added a note in careful handwriting: "The 13th Teacup, Brompton Hollow, GCH." She sealed it gently and tucked it away. And in Brompton Hollow the forget-me-nots bloomed again the following spring, small, soft blue as china. No plaque marked the place where Gwen had stood. No monument bore her name in marble, but in the village and in the memory of those who had sat at the table her presence lingered, because some mysteries, once solved, don't vanish. They echo like a melody once hummed, or a cup poured one too many times.